Virginia, Washington, California, and Texas today. So we probably had some people waiting for the stream. Thank you to the Smith family for coming out here and replacing all of our people that are usually here. We know some people are watching online, so we'll go ahead and get started. So we're talking about foreign missions today. This time of year is in the OPC is usually when we collect a thanks offering. If you're new, it's hard to look at the screen, so it's more just a reference point. And so we want to talk about the work of foreign missions, and we want to close our time by praying for some of them. This is a highly untechnical map of where some OPC missionaries may or may not be. So let's get started. We're just going to talk a little bit about the history of the OPC when it comes to foreign missions, and then our current missionary works, and we'll pray for them. All right, we've used this picture before. We're talking about evangelism, but there's certainly the reputation. I forgot to put the actual quote in there. That's what I get for copying and pasting too much. I was reading an article on foreign missions from Table Talk a couple weeks ago, and the article led off with a quote by a Roman Catholic bishop suggesting that Protestant and Reformed churches didn't have a history of foreign missions, right? That it was the Roman Catholic Church that reached the world, and that ever since the Protestant Reformation happened, the Protestant Church hasn't been active in foreign missions. That lines up well with the kind of stereotype of Reformed people, the frozen chosen. There's your Presbyterian in a block of ice. The reality of the matter is very much the opposite, right? That the Protestant Reformation was an explosion in missions. Specifically, the Puritans talked often about how they saw themselves as missionaries, even though they were in their own hometowns. That's because so many places didn't have the gospel. And even as the Reformers, between Calvin's Geneva and the Dutch Reformed in the Netherlands and the Puritans in England and Scotland, even as they were so desperately trying to reform and build faithful churches in their own towns, they still spent time and money and energy sending missionaries to other places. Notably, really early on, places like Ireland, which was very Catholic, received a lot of immediate missionary support when the New World was discovered. I guess it was already discovered, but as more and more trips became more and more common, the Protestant Reformed churches sent a lot of missionaries to the New World. That included, as trade opened up, places like Africa with David Livingstone, India with William Carey, Hudson Taylor in China famously. And then we have a lot of American missionaries. All these people had kind of Reformed Protestant leanings: George Whitefield, David Brainerd, Jonathan Edwards. So the fact of the matter is that the Reformed, Presbyterian, faithful churches have an extremely long and fervent history when it comes to foreign missions. Now, when it comes to the OPC, actually, you could say that foreign missions was the proximate cause of the birth of our entire denomination. So in 1932, the mainline Presbyterian Church issues a paper, which then turns into like a 7-volume book entitled Rethinking Missions. And this book is intended as something of a murderer's row. It's actually funded by John Rockefeller. He's the one who puts all of the money into this study. He pays all of the great Presbyterian scholars of the day to write a book on what missions should be. And the main thesis of Rethinking Missions, this report of the mainline Presbyterian Church, they made this one point, which was that predominantly, because the world is changing, it is expecting a newer, more progressive type of Christianity. Therefore, when it comes to foreign missions, our strategy and our teaching needs to change alongside the spirit of the age. Well, when Machen and other faithful pastors discovered this, they were horrified. The idea that we needed to somehow change the Bible or change the gospel to reach a lost world was terrifying to them, as it should be to us. Right? We know it was the gospel of Jesus Christ that went into the Greco-Roman world. That world was full of competing ideas and terrible moral, family, sexual ethics, slavery, barbarism. It went into that world and it transformed that world. It went into Norse Scandinavia and it transformed that world. It came to the New World. It changed this world. So the idea that for some reason at the dawn of the 20th century, now the church had to change its doctrine, had to change its teaching, that was completely wrong. And as a small kind of picture of what's going on is the somewhat fascinating, somewhat frustrating story of Pearl Buck. Now, if you went to high school in America, there's a good chance that you were forced to read Pearl Buck's book, The Good Earth, and I want to apologize for that on behalf of Presbyterians everywhere. It's not a good book. But she was a Presbyterian missionary when she wrote it in China. She was supported by the Presbyterian Missions Board. Pearl Buck, because this book ended up winning not only the Pulitzer Prize, but it won her the Nobel Prize in Literature, which just goes to show you that those titles don't mean as much as you think they do. I would remind you that Yasser Arafat has a Nobel Peace Prize. She becomes kind of the lightning rod for what's going on. Because Pearl Buck and many, many missionaries like her across the world, specifically in China, just kind of openly, out loud in the press, denied core doctrines of Christianity. So this is what Pearl Buck said about rethinking missions. She said that that book represents a masterly statement of religion and its place in the world. This is the only book I have ever read which seems to me literally true in every observation. Well, what about the Bible, Miss Buck? I'm not trying to be glib here. She's saying that this book that's trying to restate the gospel and the point of foreign missions is the best thing she's ever read. She's famous for a couple quotes just denying basic Christianity. She said, even though if it would be proved in some future time that there never lived an actual Christ, and what we think of as Christ should be seen as the essence of men's dreams, would I be willing to let that dream pass? It is enough to know the meaning of Christ's life and how he lived as a support for every type of person. Right, so she was just like, it doesn't matter if Jesus lived, she denied the virgin birth, and that was a lot of missionaries, and that's, you can be probably not surprised why they approved of this Rethinking Missions book. So faithful ministers in the Presbyterian Church felt, I think correctly, that it was inappropriate to be spending the tithe money of widows and orphans and ordinary Christians overseas to support people as missionaries who were with every day of their life undermining the work of the gospel. So they tried their own papers, they kept getting ripped apart, so eventually they created what was known as the Independent Missions Board in 1934. And so these faithful churches would send missionaries who, believed in the gospel, believed in the Bible to these foreign lands. This is not to say that, J. Gresham Machen was trying to have Pearl Buck arrested and tarred and feathered. Actually, really fascinatingly, when John Gresham Machen died, Pearl Buck wrote a fairly glowing eulogy of him. She said that he was a titan among men, although she disagreed with him on every point of doctrine. She greatly respected not only his intellect, but his character. And she said the world had lost a great teacher when Machen died. That was how much his opponents thought of him. Another H.L. Mencken, when Machen died, said he was comparing Machen to William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president twice, was a very famous Presbyterian. And he said Machen was to William Jennings Bryan as the Matterhorn was to a molehill. So all these people who disapproved of Machen, they still saw that this conviction that he had in the Bible was something that was honorable. But the actual mainline Presbyterian Church did not agree, in a sense, with Mencken or Buck. So 2 years after they formed the Independent Missions Board, J. Machen is defrocked by the mainline Presbyterian Church. They revoke his credentials as a minister. And in essence, basically, for paying missionaries to preach the gospel, they fire him as a pastor. And so that's when, in 1936, he and other ministers who have been fired for supporting foreign missionaries form the OPC. So this is a very real way in which we should understand that foreign missions is at the heart of our denomination. It's why we exist, right? There are a lot of fights going on. We just finished a 3-week series on Christianity and liberalism, which you can find on our YouTube page, taught by Doug Whitehead. But we should understand that from the very beginning, the heart of the Presbyterian Church towards overseas missionaries was so firm that there was no willingness to compromise, to let the rest of the world go to waste for the sake of compromise or money. So the OPC was in a lot of ways founded around the idea of the importance of foreign missions and our inability to compromise. So that means the next year we had the very first OPC foreign missionaries. The first, I think 8, if I'm getting my numbers right. There's only 6 in that photo. There is Mr. Andrews and Mr. and Mrs. Corey were sent to Manchuria. If anyone knows your history, at that point, Manchuria is kind of northeastern China. It's actually run by Japan as this kind of, it was an awful situation of kind of suffering, persecution, abuse. But it's Japanese-ruled China, and so these missionaries go there. Mr. and Mrs. Gaffin go to China. If those names are familiar to you, that's because Richard Gaffin Jr., still alive, but fairly well-known OPC professor, a brilliant theologian, longtime professor at Westminster Seminary. These are his parents, missionaries in China, and he's born in China on the mission field as these very first set of OPC missionaries. And so that's just really cool, I think, about the heart of missions inside the OPC. Mr. McElwain and Mr. and Mrs. Friend go to Tokyo to do missions there, and then Mr. and Mrs. Hunt, and they're in the picture, I can't pick them out, I'm sorry, end up doing missions in first Manchuria, but it's Korean-speaking missions in Manchuria, which borders Korea. Then eventually they cross the border down into Korea. So you can see right away, as soon as they could, the OPC starts commissioning, supporting foreign missionaries. And what's really cool about these locations, right, China, Tokyo, Korea, is they have been absolute focuses for the OPC ever since to really interesting, different results. So I think it's just good to see that from the very beginning, we were created out of foreign missions. We've been devoted to foreign missions. So now I want to talk a little bit about the OPC's view of missions. This is pulled from their website. And I love it. And I remember I came to this conviction before I came to the OPC. I think it's a beautiful way to think about foreign missions, right? And I love all of our brothers and sisters from every Protestant denomination, Methodists, Baptists, Anglicans. God bless all of them. They go over the world. We're probably most used to kind of evangelical, parachurch foreign missions like Frontiers. And usually what you see is like one person, usually they're pretty young, sends you a bunch of letters, raises a bunch of support to go kind of just unattached on their own with a little oversight. Now I want to say that those can be wonderful things. I think it's great for young people to go overseas. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful gift. So I'm not against that, but as a long-term model, I don't think that's sustainable. The OPC's long-term model is really what I think the model of the church has been from the very beginning, which is when the gospel goes to a new place, the point is to build up an independent, indigenous church in that place, right? And so when you take the gospel to Turkey, you want Turkish pastors preaching the gospel to Turkish people in the Turkish language, right? And then when we go to Denmark, we want Danish pastors preaching the gospel to Danish people in the Danish language. And if you just even look at our hymn book, right, you can see what this biblical type of missions does, right? Is we have so many hymns that come from Sweden, that come from Germany, that come from Wales as the gospel goes, and these people in their own languages write their own hymns, right? Because these are indigenous churches. This is what the gospel does. And so that's the goal of OPC foreign missions, is eventually, and Chris Hartshorn said this so beautifully, no, sorry, it was Dave Crum. Hartshorn, you don't get credit for this. It was Crum who said it. He was actually quoting Piper, so Crum doesn't get credit either. Piper says famously that the goal of missions is worship, right? The goal of foreign missions in any country is to eventually not have foreign missions in that country, right? For the gospel to go forth in power, for human beings to be converted to the gospel and for them to be Christians so that they don't need any more missionaries. We're actually going to see a success story of that in just a minute. So that's the goal, right, is to convert and train locals. So how does that start? There's kind of a fourfold step. If you go on the OP's website, you have exploratory fields. We go to the area and we find out whether or not it makes sense for that people in that area to be a target of foreign missions. And so you'll send someone over maybe short-term, maybe long-term. Maybe this is why a field only has one worker for a season, because you're exploring the field, you're getting to know it. The OPC cares a great deal, and I love this, about finding the right personnel in foreign missions. So Doug Clausen, who's the Home Secretary right now, says, and I think correctly, that when it comes to full-time missionary evangelists, right, the people overseeing the work, we want ministers. And we don't only just want actual ordained, trained ministers. We want ordained, trained ministers who have been pastors already, right? And so if someone's trying to go overseas, we really want them to have actually pastored an American church for a couple of years. What I appreciate about this is sometimes accidentally we can end up thinking that the church, the global church, the church in other countries, for some reason needs or deserves less than American churches do, right? It's okay that we're sending them totally untrained 23-year-olds. We kind of do this with youth ministry too, right? Where we take the most vulnerable age group and we give the youngest and least trained teachers to teach the most vulnerable kids in our church. Sometimes we do this foreign missions, right? We need to preach the gospel in a new language to a new people with cultural problems and political problems and economic problems. So yeah, let's just send young people who don't know what they're doing. So one of the things the OPC really wants to focus on is that for long-term established missions, we want to send actual trained ministers and wives and families who will be planted there, build roots there, and are able to fill in. Of course, we have lots of other missionaries. We'll get to that in Uganda. Of course, we do short-term mission trips. Those are so important for us to go over there and see what it's like and to help. But that focus on personnel, I think, is wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. part of OPC Foreign Missions. Another part that I really love is that the OPC aims to really fully support our missionaries. And so I've been on mission trips. A lot of you have probably been on mission trips, and you remember a big part of mission trips is raising funding. And I think when it comes to short-term mission trips, that's a good thing. It's a good thing to learn that it's okay to ask for money for Jesus. It's okay to ask for prayer. It kind of builds your character, your confidence in the gospel. But for long-term missionaries, this is a big problem, is they have to continually come off the field for the sake of fundraising. And they'll tell you that really can be a hindrance. Because right as things get going, or maybe things are actually in a really bad state and they need to stay there and help, but actually we got to fly back to America for 6 months to raise money. So one of the OPC's other distinctives when it comes to foreign missions is to, as much as we can, really, truly, fully or largely support our missionaries so they don't have to worry about consistently seeking funding. Sometimes that means it looks like we don't have as many missionaries in the field, right? And the truth is I think we have a lot for a church of our size, but we don't, because we don't do this kind of scattershot approach. But I think what that does is it really frees up the missionaries to do the work of church planting in those countries. And that was true of Providence as a church planter. They do this for home missions as well. The OPC really goes above and beyond in supporting home and foreign missions. I think we've seen in Providence that it has been a tremendous benefit, just how much the OPC has supported us. I think we see overseas that's true as well. And then once you know where you want to go, you have the people, you have the support, we have these established fields where we plan long-term works. And again, the goal of these long-term works is for eventually the missionaries to become defunct, right? To have been totally taken over by local, national, indigenous people who are now doing the work fully themselves. And so an example of this is Korea. So we just showed in that first picture that some of the very first missionaries the OPC sent out as an individual denomination was Korea. The Hunts went to Korea. Now, if you know your history of Korea, it was closed down for a long time because it was controlled by Japan. There was a lot of persecution there. It's really kind of the turn of the 20th century where missionaries begin to flourish in Korea, and it's the Presbyterian church, out of all the denominations, the beginning of the 20th century really starts to focus on Korea. And so the Hunts were already in Korea actually as mainline Presbyterian missionaries, but then they switched to the OPC. We send them out there, and they're doing work. The next step, and this is something that we've done in China and other places, is you establish a seminary. Why do you establish a seminary in Korea? Right, that's the point, right? We want to actually train them, right? We don't want them subsisting on us. It's their country, it's their gospel too. And so you have a seminary to train existing, maybe evangelical Protestants there who just need the training, who need the support. And so one of the main things that we do is we look at other churches in the area, how we can come alongside them. The OPC is not anti-other churches. That's a big part of when we find a mission field is who can we work with, who can we come alongside. So this is, we're training existing pastors, we're training new ones. Then eventually a family, the Hard family, joins in 1954. You can imagine this is difficult. I don't know if you've read, but there was a war in Korea not long after World War II. Then eventually the Sun family, who are Koreans themselves, become OPC missionaries in Korea in 1977. And then a really huge thing that happens in 1983 is the Missionary Training Institute is founded. And so that's what the building looks like today. And you can imagine if we're starting with one family in Korea in 1937, and that's now where these things, you can see the growth of the church in Korea. And it's really just been a wonderful story. It's not that Korea is perfect or the Korean church is perfect, but there is there has been a massive work of Christianity in South Korea. Specifically Presbyterian Reformed churches. To this day, one of the NAPARC churches, one of our sister churches in America, is called the Korean Presbyterian Church in America. So it's a Korean language church in America, and they're almost as big as the OPC themselves, right? And that's just how many missions went to Korea, how the gospel flourished on that peninsula. There are very large, faithful Presbyterian denominations right now in South Korea, and a lot of them come through the Missionary Training Institute, which was founded by the OPC. And so eventually they got to a place where in 2009, the OPC handed over the work to local Korean Presbyterian Church. So right now there are no OPC foreign missionaries in Korea because the Koreans are preaching the gospel to their own people and awesomely to the world. And so after the United States of America, the country that sends the most foreign missionaries is South Korea. South Korea, not anywhere in Europe, not anywhere in North America. Korea sends more missionaries than anyone except for us. And that's despite the fact, by the way, that their population is about the size of California. And they send, I think they have over 30,000 missionaries now in the world. So the Korean church really took the missions, and so that the Missionary Training Institute was a big part of that. And so that's basically, all foreign missions is a success story, right? The Lord will save by many or by few. David Livingstone, one of the most famous missionaries ever, you probably heard of in a sitcom, someone cheekily says, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. That's about David Livingstone. There's a whole fun story with that. He only had one convert in his whole life, and yet his mission work was vital to opening up the entire continent of Africa to mission. So we don't just want to count numbers. We just want to count that. So all of these are success stories because the gospel is being faithfully preached. But what we see in Korea is the OPC's style of evangelism come to fruition, right? That we sent people there. They stayed for a very long time. They built roots. They built up the church in Korea to the point where the church in Korea took over the work, and we don't send missionaries to South Korea anymore. So I'll go back to the very beginning. This is just a sister OPC church threw this up on their website. So sometimes when it comes to foreign missionary, it's hard because a lot of missionaries are in places where they're not safe. We don't want to publicize where they are. So I'm going to try to go through quickly our foreign mission fields. I've reached out to the Committee on Foreign Missions. They have prayer cards and things they send out. I think we missed those rotations because we're a church plant. But hopefully we'll get those soon. For now, just to run through the major mission fields of the OPC. And so we have a mission field in Quebec. I have no idea. Has Annalise been there? Yes. Yes, okay, she has. I know she speaks French. I did not know that was connected to French Canada. And so there's a mission field in French Canada. A quick advertisement for our library with our librarian, Bradley Evans, back there. One of the books, maybe the book that most affected, one of the books that most affected me outside of the Bible is actually a biography of a church planter in French Canada called The Memoirs of an Ordinary Pastor. It's actually D.A. Carson's dad. And he just goes through how really, really hard it is. We think of Canada as just America but colder, or America but nicer, right? Yeah. America but cleaner, right? But French Canada is very unchristian, right? It is, in the province of Quebec itself, North Canada right now, it is a majority atheist. And it's one of the few civilized places in the world that has a majority or plurality, I think, of atheists. It's also very Roman Catholic. So church planting in French Canada is actually a really, really hard field. It's really, really noble work, and we tend not to think of that way. We think, oh, Quebec, like that's nice. Can I do foreign missions in Miami? But no, it's a really hard work. We have missionaries in Haiti. We have one of the things that I can talk about now is that the OPC does partner with the PCA, which is also a sister church of Life, Faith, and Practice. They're a much larger church with a much larger missionary organization called Mission to the World, or MTW for short. So there are sometimes MTW missionaries that we partner with. We call them ministry associates. And we help them because the PCA doesn't have our policy of fully supporting all of their missionaries. And so they often need to raise support. So one of the things the OPC can do strategically is find PCA ministries in areas they want to partner with and come alongside and meet that support. And so I think that the Fields are missionary associates in Haiti. The Hops are there as well. Uruguay, the Richlines have been there for a while. We'll see there are actually some new missionaries in the field. I'm not actually familiar with the Paysons at all, but I've been praying for them according to New Horizons. So if you know anything about them, feel free to chime in when we're praying. Czech Republic, a lot of us know Jerry and Marilyn Farnick, who have been there for a very, very long time. They host English Camp and Team Praha. A lot of our members have gone over there before. We have missionaries in Ukraine. Actually, the OPC has been doing a lot of diaconal work, these support boxes in Ukraine, obviously, as it's in the midst of war and terrible, terrible tragedy. We have associates in Ethiopia, which is actually really struggling right now with a lot of persecution. And so we're just being asked to pray for the Ethiopian Reformed Presbyterian Church. Our people are working with them. We've long had a presence in Japan that continues now. I found out recently the Smith family knows the Lowers. Dan explained that to me quite excitedly. They were supposed to actually visit here. We weren't able to get them on their furlough. But we have a large presence in Japan and in, I'm just going to say East Asia, because this is being recorded. So we have missionaries in Asia as well, in difficult countries that we're called to pray for. What you'll notice is Uganda is not on here. That's where I want to close with, is Uganda, which is definitely the OPC's most concentrated work right now. You can see we have a lot of missionaries and missionary associates in Uganda, specifically working with in Karamojong, the Karamoja people. There is a clinic. I'm not going to try to butcher the name of the clinic, but we have actually a clinic that runs there. The gospel is preached every day as people are also waiting for medical care. And we have diaconal missionaries in Uganda. If you read New Horizons, the Emmets are just going out there right now. I think Travis might be new as well. So Uganda is a clear point of focus for the OPC. And when we have that desire to see locals being raised up, I think two places where we see that right now is really in Uruguay and in Uganda. And we want to see that next generation of indigenous, of local pastors do the work there of preaching the gospel and taking over the work of missions in those areas. So those are our missionaries. I know that we have more, I'm sure, that I missed, and I feel terrible about it. New Horizons is a wonderful resource. There's a prayer calendar in the back. But I usually go along, so instead of going along, I wanted to pause if anyone has any questions or comments, or Alexander's been to maybe half of these foreign missionary fields, just himself. Alexander, if you wanted to add anything, or if we had any questions about it, and then we'll go into a time, we'll close with a time of praying for these mission works. I'll try to alternate back and forth about these mission works while we're praying, so you can pray as you're led. But any questions, thoughts, comments? Alexander, if you want to chime in. Yeah, that's right. Alexander has a heart for it. Okay. Hop. Yeah. Or Westerveld, okay. We have too many Bens. Okay, that's good. That's wonderful. Thank you, Alexander. And feel free to pester him more after, by the way, because I wasn't joking. Alexander's been to several of these places, several mission fields. Annalise has as well. So they're kind of our resident missionary contacts. Any questions about missions? Anything we've gone over? Specific works? Anyone volunteering to be a foreign missionary? Verbal contracts are binding in the state of Arizona, so just be careful if you commit. They are actually binding, but we won't hold you to it, just to be clear. Questions, comments, anything? All right, wonderful. Well, yeah, let's close with a season of prayer for our brothers and sisters overseas, for the churches in these areas. Just a reminder that the OPC Thanks offering is going on, and so if you're at Providence on Sunday, if you want to make a note in your offering that it's for the Thank offering, we will make sure that gets to worldwide outreach on your behalf. Let's go ahead and start praying. This is a big cavernous space. The sound bounces in weird ways. So we just encourage you to not worry about that. Just start praying. If someone can't hear you and starts praying over you, then my suggestion is to just keep praying because they can't hear you. And so clearly you're not going to disrupt them. They don't need to disrupt you. So actually, simultaneous prayer is extremely common in most of the Eastern churches. In Korea in particular, they do a lot of, there's a specific name for it, but simultaneous prayer is really common. So yeah, please just pray as the Spirit leads you. You can pray quietly, but I know we'd be edified if you can pray out loud for the brothers and sisters in Quebec, Haiti, Uruguay, Czech Republic, Ukraine, Ethiopia, Japan, East Asia, and Uganda. If you will, please bow your head and let's pray.